Well, I am delighted to be here in a room full of airplanes, which makes me very happy. But it's so much fun to be here to talk about a rather unusual campaign and to talk about, in particular, the airplane that was at the center of it. So, grab this. This is very important to have. The Superfortress is an extraordinary airplane in every possible regard. Basically, it was a leap forward into modernity. The Air Force, U.S. Army Air Forces at that point, it would become the U.S. Air Force later, was thinking about needing a very long-range bomber. This is in 1939, 1940, when they're not sure what the situation in Europe is going to be. So they start to think, and being the Air Force, and forward thinkers that they are, they jump into the future and make demands that are quite extraordinary. And at the helm of all of this is General Henry Hap Arnold, who's the chief of the Army Air Forces at that point, but also a man who is very interested in technology, in the future, and in having the Air Forces ultimately become independent of the Army. All of those things are terribly important, so he wants a platform that will make this happen. And the B-20, what becomes the B-29 is his vision for how to have this happen. And of course, he's imagining that the future of warfare is going to be heavily reliant on strategic bombing. And he gains a number of backers because the president in particular is quite interested in this. If you are the head of a democracy, you're always worrying about casualties in war, and you're looking for ways to reduce them if possible. And also, having a large standing army is very expensive, and it can be politically and socially disruptive. So if there's a way you can get around it, and you happen to have wonderful moats on your west and your east, you might look to technology. And that's what the Americans did. And the Air Force was really pushing this program. So if you just look at some of the text there, you can see what was going on. Boeing took up this gamble in 1940. And they, as you can see, 1.5 million man-hours and $2.8 million to produce 10,000 drawings for prototypes. This airplane, because it was so accelerated, basically Arnold wanted it in time for the campaign, wanted it in time for the war to be fought. He accelerated and telescoped everything about this airplane, which meant that everything was a gamble, everything was a risk. All new technology, it was pushing the outer edge of technology in every conceivable realm. And in fact, they built this airplane and they went forward with it and went forward with the production orders when there was really only a pile of blueprints and a wooden mock-up to support it. And there were 1,600 airplanes, B-29s, ordered before the first one actually took to the skies. So with so much riding on this and so many new things occurring at the same time, it was truly the $3 million gamble, which was its nickname. But as you can see, it's going to fly further and higher and faster and carry more bombs further than any airplane has ever done in the past. It had a pressurized cabin. It had the latest in navigational technology. It had guns that could be sight converge on a single target, controlled by a computer. Basically, a fire control system that was very, very forward-looking and beyond anything that had been conceived before. Powered by 6 generators and an electrical system that would include more than 125 electric motors and 15,000 feet of wiring. So each plane required more than 40,000 different parts, and Boeing had to keep track of all of those subcontractors. So this was perhaps the most risky and most reckless, perhaps, many did say at the time, reckless project of the Second World War. But it had a lot of backing by important people, including the president, including Harry Hopkins, including Robert Lovett. They were all close to the president, they all believed in air power, and they pushed this airplane. It was, at the time, as you can imagine, the pride of Boeing. Boeing was partnering in taking this great leap into the future. And basically one of the heads of this program was the famous and brilliant test pilot, Edmund Turney Allen, or Eddie Allen, who was fabulous at his job. He was an unusual man. He was MIT trained. He was an aerodynamic engineer. He was a practitioner of yoga, and he was a vegetarian. So he was a very interesting guy. He was a very wiry little wisp of a man, but he flew immense airplanes. He flew basically the Stratoliner, the Constellation, the Coronado, the DC line for Boeing. He basically was in on the shakedown of all those airplanes. And in fact, it was hard to get insurance for these new prototypes, big prototypes, if Eddie Allen was not at the controls. There were other folks involved. George Scherer designed a whole new wing. Harlan Fowler designed the really revolutionary flaps. They're common now, but at the time they were revolutionary air-catching flaps for the airplane. And just so many people who were really at the best in the world were involved in this project. Oops, jump forward. Okay, but as you can imagine, with this much new stuff happening all at once, and you're trying to stitch it all together or weld it all together into the same machine, you're going to have problems. And this is Curtis LeMay's famous quote: "The B-29s had as many bugs as the entomological department at the Smithsonian." It was full of problems, basically because it was being tested as it went into combat. Literally. It was going so fast. And the biggest problem that the airplane, it had many problems. It had many things that were exciting, but all those things that were exciting were also risky, and then many of them were problems, including the landing gear and a variety of other things. But the biggest problem were the engines. These were the very complex, huge Wright R3350 engines that were air-cooled, but unfortunately, there wasn't enough air flowing over the nacelles. The nacelle openings were not big enough to really cool these massive engines. And so they were prone to engine fires. And engine fires began to appear pretty much right away, but they were a particular problem in the early test flights in December of 1942 and January of 1943. Has anyone been on an airplane that's on fire? Okay, a few of us out there. You'll recall, those of you who have done it, it's quite character building, but you could hardly fly a B-29 without having an engine fire. In fact, a lot of pilots said, I got the most two-engine time I ever had in the B-29. So here's the Wright Cyclone engine. Again, it's extraordinary, it's forward-leaning, but it's very problematical. And this is another famous Curtis LeMay quote: "This equipment never should have been destined to power operational aircraft without a long period of trial and investigation, and trial again." But it was so ordered. And it was so ordered because they were on such a compressed time schedule. They had to move out. But again, this went back to the power that the president had in projecting, in insisting on this program and in driving it forward. So lots of money, men, material, expertise was drawn to this program. And its strategy and strategic planning is about trade-offs. So this plane has some very interesting implications in terms of the trade-offs that we made in the Second World War. This sucked in tremendous amounts of money and expertise and crew. And those crew might have been doing other things, particularly maybe in the winter and early spring of 1944-45, when we were desperately in need of riflemen. So if you look at the bottom quote here, you will have a sense of how exciting and how character building it could be to fly this airplane, particularly in its early days. Swallowing a valve was a major problem. And these engines would burn very hot. They had magnesium crankcases. This airplane burned quite hot. It was hard to put these fires out. And of course, there were problems with the props. Losing your prop is an exciting thing to have happen if you're a pilot. And then having the engine actually fall out of the airplane is even more exciting. On the 18th of February, 1943, Eddie Allen climbed into the second prototype, and he had with him 10 of Boeing's very most senior people. They were trying, I mentioned the airplane fires that had occurred in December and January. Now they're trying to figure out what's going on. They're on a tight time schedule. They've got to do it. They cram their best people into the second prototype, and if you kind of know where I'm going, yes, brace yourself. It is a sad story. Engine number 1 catches fire. It quickly spreads to the wing. It's a very hot fire, and then it goes into the fuselage of the airplane. Eddie Allen, again, being tremendously steely, calm pilot, turns and tries to make it to the landing strip at Renton, and just cannot make it. They know they're in very serious trouble. A couple of people, again, these fabulous Boeing engineers, try to bail out, but they're too low. Eddie Allen, they actually crash into the Fry meatpacking plant in downtown Seattle. And all aboard are killed, and about 19 people in the factory die as well. It's a huge, almost unfathomable loss to Boeing and to this program. Hap Arnold had just been on a long tour around the world. He gets the news of this crash and suffers the first of multiple heart attacks he would suffer in the course of the Second World War. One of the things that one realizes when you study these folks in this situation is that they were under tremendous pressure, huge, crushing pressure all the time. And those multiple heart attacks aren't hard to fathom, especially in days without the kinds of cardiac treatment we have today. But General Arnold, despite the heart attack, despite the setback, absolutely pushed on. He was determined that this airplane was going to fly. Now it was very clear that it was probably going to head principally to the Far Eastern Theater. And Roosevelt was frustrated. He wanted this airplane there. He wanted bombing of Japan. And he wanted something that would help boost Chiang Kai-shek's morale. He was feeling that we had let down the Chinese over and over again. It had not been a high priority theater for us with everything else on our plate. And there was a concern that Chiang was getting frustrated with us, and Roosevelt felt this very keenly. And I think he felt that if the B-29 could fly from China, behind Japanese lines, obviously a lot of China is occupied by the Japanese, but fly from an area that was safe in China, it would be prestigious for Chiang Kai-shek, and it would be a morale boost for China, and it would signal our commitment to China. So that's one of the reasons why they plan on this very interesting scheme that becomes Matterhorn. But before that happens, the airplanes have to fly, and they have to get to the theater. Arnold looks at the situation in the winter and decides, actually, we've got to get these airplanes going. So he sends crews, Boeing engineers, to the facility that was producing B-29s in Wichita, Kansas, and they fight a domestic battle called the Battle of Kansas. What they do is when they roll the airplanes off the production line, they take them out to the tarmac, and they make approximately 50 to 55 changes, major changes to the airplane on the tarmac. This is in March of 1944 in Kansas. So it's freezing, it's sub-zero temperatures, driving blizzards, the worst imaginable circumstances, and yet these engineers and men and crews are out there doing it to make this airplane fly. Sometimes, as it says in the bottom, they disconnect every single electrical circuit and fuel circuit in the airplane to put a new engine in. Oops. Okay, this is a bit of an eye chart, so I'm going to skip over it quickly. I just want to point out that the 20th Air Force is going to be controlled directly by Hap Arnold and the Joint Chiefs. This is an unusual arrangement. It's not going to the theater commander. You will recognize that there was not a great deal of unity of command in the Pacific, and this concerned Arnold a great deal. And he especially didn't want his prize B-29s to go to Nimitz in the Navy or to MacArthur and his airman Kenny, to Stilwell, to Mountbatten. It probably could have made many contributions in all of those places, and they all wanted it, but Arnold was determined that this was going to be a long-range strategic bomber for Japan. Okay, once the airplanes are ready, they leave from Kansas and they do this around-the-world trip to get to their ultimate destination, which is Calcutta, and it does not go well. As they go eastward into higher and higher temperatures, the engines have more and more problems, overheating, and every time they come to a major stop, or every time they lose an airplane or multiple airplanes, they send more Boeing engineers to try to solve the problem. So it's really just an extraordinary human effort taking place to get these airplanes where they need to go and into the theater. Now, this is the crazy scheme for Matterhorn. Basically, the airplanes were going to be based in India, but they were going to forward stage out of Chengdu. I don't have a pointer that can reach that, but what you can see, if you look at the geography, basically, is that they had to fly everything into the theater, and they had to fly it over the Himalayas. In order to get enough fuel for a B-29 to fly to, they could just reach the perimeter, the outer edges of Japan, and they could reach a number of other targets. But in order to be able to do that, they had to fly over the Himalayas 7 times to bring in enough fuel for one raid on Japan. So logistically, this was a crazy, crazy, crazy scheme. But again, we were so anxious to start bombing Japan that we went forward. Okay. That's basically the bottom line with the logistics and the fuel. So when this starts, it's under the control of Brigadier General Kenneth Wolfe, who had been directing the program, developing the airplane itself. But he didn't last very long as the commander. Things didn't go particularly well. The raids were difficult. As you can imagine, the logistical situation was almost impossible. And he was replaced fairly quickly, first by General Blondie Saunders, but then by the person who was increasingly becoming the star of the United States Army Air Forces, and Arnold's fair-haired boy, Curtis LeMay. He wasn't fair-haired, but the metaphor is appropriate. LeMay was a problem solver. He had done very good work in Europe. He had solved a lot of problems for the combined bomber offensive there, and was just instinctively very good at getting a lot out of airplanes and crews. Before he went out to the theater to take the Operation Matterhorn, he went up to Omaha and he got thoroughly familiar with the airplane. He wanted to know every inch of it to figure out how to get the best out of it. Of course, he faced the same problems that the first 2 commanders had faced. Again, the same sorts of issues, engine fires. Oh, and the blisters, the gun sight blisters, had a nasty tendency to pop out. In a pressurized airplane, that's a very big problem, and I can talk a little bit more about that in the question and answer if you want to. It had tragic circumstances in some cases until they figured out how to solve that problem. Okay, a few typical missions. There were not a lot of raids. Basically, once a week is about the best they could do because they had to fly in all of their fuel. So they started off very slowly, but they were trying to hit aircraft factories and steel in particular. When LeMay then comes in and replaces Blondie Saunders in late August of 1944. And what he does at that point is basically the same thing that the others had done, but he works very, very hard to do as well as he possibly can to solve the problems. And the key thing is that he never complains. He never sends a letter back. He sends letters back to Arnold saying, I've got problems, but he always then lists all the things he's doing to solve them, which wins Arnold's confidence. Perhaps the most important target that he hits, though, is Hankow in mid-December of 1944, where he uses 100% incendiaries. And the Air Force likes the results from that raid. It actually produces more devastation to the target than the other raids that they had been flying, and it sets up sort of a harbinger for the future. Okay, just to end here, basically on the operation itself, and I'll continue on a little bit on just one other thing. This sums it up. This is LeMay's comment at the end. He basically said no one could have made this particular operation work. It was so difficult logistically. But a couple of things happened. The main thing I would say in terms of this is not only the important incendiary raid on Hankow that LeMay waged in December, but also because LeMay did such good work in this theater, it set him up to ultimately replace Haywood Hansell when Hansell was relieved of command for the 21st Bomber Command, which was the flights against Japan out of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, out of the Marianas. That campaign became the focal point of, by the autumn, really, of 44, the focal point of the air campaign in the Far East. And LeMay was instrumental in, of course, getting that underway and then turning to low-level nighttime incendiary raids against Japanese cities. But here's a key point. In this letter, and the letters from Arnold to LeMay and back from LeMay to Arnold are absolutely fascinating. I've never seen so much pressure being placed onto a theater commander as was placed on the shoulders of Curtis LeMay by Arnold. And that pressure was coming from Marshall, from the President, through Marshall, through Arnold, to LeMay. Huge pressure. But this is key. In this letter, Arnold switches from using the introduction, Dear LeMay, to Dear Kurt, and he says, we're watching you very carefully, and we're passing everything you do on to Haywood Hansell in the Marianas. So Arnold has got his eye very much on LeMay. He's deciding this key campaign with this key weapon system that so much has been invested in, the B-29, is going to be put into the hands of Curtis LeMay, which happens in basically late December, but it's formalized in January of 1945. So I think I shall wrap up there, lest I go way over my time, and I don't want to do that. I want to save time for questions. But again, thank you so much for letting me talk about this fascinating episode in World War II. Yes, they were very unhappy about the presence of those bases, and it did cause difficulties. I would say there were lots of people who were very concerned about Matterhorn. When you look at it on paper, it looks pretty crazy, and there were many people who raised lots of objections and were deeply concerned about whether this was just a pointless diversion of resources and essential resources that could have done other things in the war. And the quote that I put up on one of the slides where General LeMay says, I'm not sure even Hap Arnold ever, I'm suspicious that maybe even Hap Arnold didn't quite believe in this. But the pressure to get bombers over Japan was so great that they were prepared to try this crazy scheme. And I think, as I said and implied in the talk, a lot of this pressure was coming right from the top. Roosevelt wanted this airplane to have an impact on Japan, and whatever it was going to take. And again, it was partly because they wanted to appease, I don't know if appease is the right word, but support Chiang Kai-shek at a moment when Chiang was complaining about not being supported and Roosevelt was feeling guilty about not having done it. They used a variety of expedients, crossover tubes and other expedients that got more air flowing over the engines. I'm not an engineer, so I don't know the exact details, but they kept working and working until they could get enough airflow over the engines to cool them adequately. Pilots are very clever about learning how to keep themselves alive. So they did develop schemes, and this was, of course, shared oral knowledge that they would all follow. Once someone had figured it out, they would try all the tricks. And you needed to know a lot of tricks for this airplane. In very early ways, there was overlap ultimately between the campaign out of the Marianas and the campaign in the CBI. And so it was being learned simultaneously. But the biggest effect, of course, was on the airplanes flying out of the Marianas because they were over the Pacific for so long. And that made them really feel the jet stream. Now, anybody trying to fly into Japan was flying into cloud cover a good bit of the time. We discovered there was cloud cover over Japan far more often than we had anticipated. Another thing that we had been shocked by after being shocked by discovering that there was a lot of cloud cover over Northern Europe, which I think probably we shouldn't have been surprised by. But nonetheless, yes, I would say that as we started flying both campaigns and they're getting underway, it's really very slow, of course, with Matterhorn. So the information coming in is coming in very slowly and incrementally. And then as you pick up in the autumn with the beginning of Haywood Hansel's campaign out of the Marianas, it really becomes quite apparent that this is a huge effect. And I'll defer to Khan because he's also an expert on this issue. This is all true, yes. B-29s did end up in Russian hands, and this was greatly distressing to Hap Arnold. And they did reverse engineer them, as you would imagine. We didn't get them back, as we asked for them, they didn't come back. And yes, they reproduced many of the problems. There were air power thinkers in Russia in the interwar years who were very interested in long-range strategic bombing. Basically, if you look, you'll find some thinkers in every industrialized country who are trying to work through this problem, and Russia had some, and they were actually quite forward-looking and interesting. They were doing interesting work. But it was very difficult to be in the military in the 1930s in Russia, and sometimes you would have major setbacks in terms of the work that you could do. And then, of course, when Barbarossa happens, the Russians are on the defensive immediately, and their first concern is to fight ground battles, and the aircraft that they're interested in really producing in large numbers has to be oriented in that direction. So they can't really kind of come back and recover, but they, as Alexandra said, they do get very interested later on and start to think, well, perhaps this would be an interesting way to carry on a war. So I think some of the thinking was there. Events overtook everything else for a while, and then they returned to thinking about it. Oh gosh. Well, first let me say that your father must have been an extraordinarily talented pilot and an extraordinarily brave man. So we are grateful for the work that he did. There are many, many books that one can turn to. This operation doesn't get a great deal of attention, but there's a very good, it's a little bit dry, but The Official History by Craven and Kate of the U.S. Army Air Forces in World War II, Volume 5, covers this theater in a good bit of detail. I actually recommend LeMay's memoir, Mission with LeMay, which is a fascinating book and really actually quite well written. He had a co-author who was a very talented writer, and it's gripping. Truly, it reads like a thriller most of the time. So that's a good resource. Anything written by Richard Frank on the Pacific Theater is absolutely worth reading. What else? And I think it's partly true, too, that we do it because we're so optimistic. You know, we have a lot of resources, but we also have this unbelievable American optimism that we can make things work if we just try hard enough. And I think that's part of what was going on here. But yes, if you just simply go to a place like ABE Books and type in Flying the Hump, you will probably come up with a number of personal accounts and interesting. And I will, if you want to talk to me afterwards, I'll take your name down and I'll try to get some more specific resources for you. It's also, I think, important to realize what was going on in the war at this time. When we really knew about Auschwitz was in the summer of 1944, because two escapees were providing very detailed information about what was there and what was going on. So even though there'd been a lot of rumors, this was really concrete evidence. And of course, that time of the war, right in the aftermath of Normandy, was incredibly fraught. Our resources were stretched to the limit in every direction. And V1s and later in September of 44, V2s were landing. And we were in a desperate effort to try to get those weapons cut off and destroyed so that they wouldn't continue to do so much damage to the Allied war effort. So it's a time when resources are stretched terribly, terribly thin. That being said, though, we were flying right in that vicinity, and in fact, we bombed an oil facility that was literally right on top of Birkenau. So there were issues about priorities and should this have become a priority target. And I've thought very hard and very long about this. It's a very painful and difficult subject because I know both sides of the story and I know the pressures, and Hungary was next. And if we had maybe attacked, perhaps the Jews in Hungary would have been protected a little bit. It's hard to say. We can't say for sure, but it's possible. There's a wonderful book that was edited by Michael Berenbaum in the 90s about this very subject, and the essays are terrific. And one that I would recommend highly is written by Gerhard Weinberg, who's sitting here, and wrote very, very thoughtfully about this issue. So I would recommend that to you. And I would also point out that I believe in January, PBS is going to air a documentary on this very topic. It's already aired in Britain on the BBC. It was very thoughtfully done. And the historians who worked on it worked hard, and the director worked very hard to get it right. So I recommend it to you. Keep an eye out. It should be on PBS in January.